Welcome to the second of our two discussions on ASMR in times of social distancing. Soft Talks is a two-part in-depth talk about ASMR and its importance for individuals on private and public scales. It's originally initiated by the designer duo Jasper Zehetgruber and Marvin Unger, who made the design project Soft Talks in a public square in Utrecht in collaboration with Raum. And these talks aim to expand and explore the relevancy and potential of ASMR in a pandemic and hopefully soon to be post-pandemic world. Yesterday, I was very happy to join in on the very first talk of the two soft talks, together with psychologist Dr. Julia Puerio, designer and media researcher Marijn Brill, and of course the designers Jasper and Marvin. We discussed the more psychological and individual occurrences that ASMR bring about. Today, I think we'll be looking a little bit more about what ASMR means beyond the internet and how we might be looking to bring them into more public spaces and museum spaces, and also indeed what the future of ASMR could mean.
I have been trained as a theater scholar. So my background is in theater and performance, but I've never felt limited to theater. And I've always been interested in seeing and finding all kinds of performances outside of the theater. So I, most of the time, look at all types of behavior and actions as a form of performance, as a form of staging. And this is also how I got interested in public space. So not only public space, let's say, as a stage for artists, but I'm also interested in looking at public space as a specific kind of performance. And I'm also involved in a research group called Urban Interfaces, indeed. And this group is interested in how technology, media, art, and performance can function as interfaces to engage with the city and to engage with urban issues in the city, and how especially art can play an important role in making visible certain tensions, frictions, and create awareness and debate around it. And I'm also part of a research group called Creative Urban Methods, interested in seeing how you can employ creative methods specifically to explore the urban and to explore the city, as a way also for researchers and students who aspire to become academics to help them expand their methodological toolkit. So not only, let's say, the more classical academic methods for research, but also to include creative methods as a way of better understanding and differently understanding the urban.
I'm a curator, trained as an architect and a writer and an editor. I've worked as an architect and found myself in curatorial practice fairly young, and now based at an institution. I act as the Swedish Center for Architecture and Design, which is Sweden's National Museum for Architecture and Design, or Architecture and Contemporary Design. And yet Weird Sensation Feels Good, which ran through most of last year, was a little bit of a risky exhibition as far as large institutions put them on, and it took a lot, I think, for this institution to stage this show. But in many ways, it is starting to trigger some very, I think, important conversations about ASMR as a kind of legitimate field of inquiry, a legitimate field of culture, and a legitimate community that needs to be understood.
So I'm an artist researcher. I am in the process of doing practice-based research as part of my PhD. And I kind of came to ASMR, well, I didn't go looking for it. I started off I'm in a drama department, and theatre and performance is my background, but I started with Foley, which is custom sound effects, concrete sound. And I just like sound. I've always played in bands. I've always been really excited about improvising and about direct experience as being my kind of point in for research. I thought the ASMR was really interesting. It struck me as a really interesting digital native performance culture, which I'm was very excited about. And so I decided to take the jump. I was like, okay, let's see, could I do it? So I, as a designer, I come from the world of movement and came to the world of sound design. And I was like, okay, well, can I design sound for this? And I'd like to speak to the risky aspect, which James mentioned. So when I the V&A approached me and said, well, we can understand, we don't want to ask an ASM artist, but we can understand an artist practitioner exploring this area through research. This is something that we feel is safer somehow.
You know, there is something about ASMR that is not purely intellectual, that is not purely bodily, that is not purely about the nervous system. It's about all three in symbiosis. It's such an incredible kind of practice that through the senses touches all aspects of you.
It opens up a very different dimension of artworks that is often very difficult to access for museum visitors. And that is indeed the object as a material object. Whereas very often, or at least in museums where you are going to see paintings, for example, or certain artifacts, the focus is often very much on what they mean or what you can use them for. And I think this way of working really opens a very other world and dimension, and that is not like what does this work mean, but what does it do to my senses? What kinds of effects does it create? And I think that's a very interesting and valuable addition to a museum experience.
Kind of sitting in between those things, I've really been able to kind of watch the intersection between aggressive responses and ignorance, which isn't to say anything cruel or unnecessary. It may be that there are people that do not feel a thing, but I agree with James's assessment that there is something for everybody here because of the way in which this movement, there's something very private has moved into a public space. And there's a very good reason for people to feel sensitive about that, I think. The smartphone, of course, has been important. Earphones have also been extremely important. I'm a sound scholar.
Absolutely.
And I think that the way in which, when people don't like ASMR, they often say, I hate it. It makes me want to cover the back of my neck. And it seems to me that what is going on here is an issue of consent around touch. If people have not given their permission to be touched quite rightly, they have a violent response. But yes, that does not mean that ASMR doesn't exist. It means that there is a complex situation arising. Maybe it's, I don't think this is a crisis of ASMR culture, because as it becomes more known and more popular, people will be a little bit calmer about, and it may be expected a little bit more, those types of approach. But it is also the case that, you know, not everything works for everyone. It's very, very subjective. So in terms of designing with ASMR, it's both exciting. I know what works for me, and so I design to my ASMR. But I also know that when you get a really, really negative response to it, it's nothing personal. It might be speaking to a very traumatic experience in somebody's past. There is a hugely exciting potential for activating collections with this stuff. They're unique. The whole point of museum collections is that they're unique, and you're not allowed to touch them. Like, that's why museums are so boring for children, really, is that you're going to go and you're not allowed to touch anything. So it seems to me as if there is an inclusivity, which is granted by ASMR as a practice for a more multisensory and more cross-modal experience. But not only that, like it won't abrade, diminish, or destroy heritage, for example.
I agree. I wonder if, James, you, in a way, you didn't translate what's already in the museum. From what I understand, your exhibition had the ASMR as almost the object itself, or the experience itself. Do you think you could elaborate a bit on this notion of having the ASMR in the museum and what that meant for you?
You know, as a national museum, you have an audience of people who are from babies all the way to super super elderly people, nearing 100. So you've got to be able to deal with the breadth of a visitor base, where actually the reality is that an extremely small portion, people between maybe roughly the ages of 14 and 24, really know what ASMR is, because it's come up on their YouTube algorithm, or it's come up on their Instagram feed or something, or they've just seen memes about it, which means that a lot of the audience of that exhibition, had never come across something like this. Autonomous sensory meridian response. When I spoke to Jennifer Allen, who coined the term, I said, what was that all about? Like I've read the stories, but it was a random selection of words that are untranslatable. I mean, I tried to translate them into Swedish. There's no point, because they don't mean anything in English either, right? There's a kind of something that's rallied around this terminology. So to be able to have to communicate to a potential visitor what they're coming into, and what they're dealing with, is extremely tricky. And to do that, I had to define many things. I had to define what trigger means. I had to define what ASMR means. I had to define what synesthesia would be. I had to define what misophonia is, for example, because we also have to accept absolutely that there is a portion of visitors who may not just feel nothing. They may have a negative reaction to what they're seeing or hearing. So dealing with that broad spectrum was extremely challenging, until I sort of backed down and I said, you know what, all people need to understand or experience this exhibition is the ability to feel. And actually, most people do. For the exhibition, we planned a whole series of live events or performances within the space. We managed to do one, the rest we did digitally. And for that reason, on the back of they had this like exhibition guide that was part of it. On the back of it, we wrote a consent form, which is impossible to read, but essentially the consent form, of many things, it did require participants of events to, number one, acknowledge their own vulnerability, number two, respect the vulnerability of others, and thirdly, be considerate of the ASMR performers. And we made every participant of a live event sign this,
I can also imagine that maybe too much context can also stand in the way of being open to the experience. So I'm also wondering like how to negotiate that, because you don't want to explain too much, I can imagine. I think that is a very important aspect. It is an encounter that is being designed. And of course, being a theater scholar, theater performance is all about live encounters and how to design those. And to not only focus on what is, so to say, happening on stage or in the video, but also what is happening in the interaction between the person who is sensing it or watching it or hearing it. And then I think what is sometimes forgotten, especially in let's say non-cultural public spaces, so let's say on a street, and also not in a festival context, but if it just pops up somewhere in public space, that designers do need to take into account how to design the invitation in the first place. So such an encounter doesn't just happen out of the blue. So you should not only design the encounter, but also, let's say, the entrance into that encounter. So James, for example, was talking about installing new types of codes in the exhibition, for example, by the consent form. And I think this is also how you can think about it when you envision such practices in other public spaces, that you really have to think carefully about how to design the invitation and to indeed create the conditions, the safe conditions in which such encounter can take place. And that, I think, is definitely more difficult, because a museum, there is a clear focus on you go into a museum because you are going to experience art in whatever kind of way. But that is not how people go out into the streets. So to install that kind of mode already asks a lot. And then we're not even talking about all the other people walking around who are not in that mode and are also maybe viewing what is happening. So I think there are many challenges on how to create, let's say, the safe conditions in which the kind of intimacy that ASMR brings about, that can be realized in a public space. And I think it's a very nice challenge actually for designers to think how to do that, because I also really see the value of encountering that type of experience in the place where you least expect it. I think it can really brighten people's days or very briefly shift their perspective. And I think that can be very interesting, because public space is not so much a space anymore where people take time to experience. It's very much a space that people move across and along to get from A to B, and to install other types of experiences there, I think could be really valuable. But I'm not a designer, so how to do this, I'm not sure. But I think this is something that people should think about.
You're setting up the brief, no? Like, and that's also the fundamental part of it, because exactly as you said, like constructing safe conditions is actually crucial, and something which I'm really unsure of. I mean, even one of the things that I acknowledged with the exhibition after long conversations with Claire Tolan and with Melinda Lau from Whisper Lodge was also in saying that ASMR does not commonly occur in group situations. It's actually, as far as we're concerned, as far as we know, it doesn't really. And that's what made this exhibition a little bit of a big risk in terms of its like performativity. And that is the interesting thing to me, is understanding that intimacy has many gradations, no? And you can be intimate with yourself, you can be intimate with another, you can be intimate with a distant other, but you can also be intimate in a crowd of 1,000. And I'm wondering, and with an object. Precisely. Let's not get into object orientation.
I'd be very interested to speak about objects, because I have designed and tried to construct a safe space. Like when I was putting museum experts into a very difficult position in some ways, because they're not ASM artists, they are museum conservators and curators. So I had to quite ask myself exactly those questions, Sigrid, and say, how can I, as James said, construct safe conditions? So this isn't something hot, like weird, strange, horrible, out of the comfort zone, because I was there to look at the native ASMR, because ASMR is everywhere. There is already a very clear situation where in shops, at cash machines, libraries, hairdressers, all kinds of public spaces already, in spite of there being lots of people around and there being a collective experience, it's about a little layer that's running through that where you find these moments of direct connection with people, objects and experiences.
People go to museums to look at other people. People go to museums for interactions. It's very, very specific museums you might go to for knowledge, but actually really most museums are social spaces. And ARCTA, the museum I work at, is a national authority. It is as much public space as a square in the center of the city would be. And for that reason, there was a lot of complexity in understanding how you do this without institutionalizing, and thereby see if it was possible to formulate feeling within a museum environment, and whether it's possible to sort of allow those relationships that are very strong, that exist online, to happen in a similar or a new way in physical public space.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, listening to both of your stories, how care manifests in so many different dimensions of ASMR. So not only in how it seems how when things or objects are touched with care, that indeed functions as a trigger, but also how Julie then carefully tried to organize the situation so that could happen. And how you, in your situation as a curator, thought very carefully about care and consent. And so it seems that this is something, I mean, we can call it care or something else, but that this is something that ties all those aspects together. So both on terms of the actual sensation, how you design it, how you stage it, how you experience it, and how you exchange it with others, all seem to be held together by this notion of care.
I think it's time to talk about the cranial nerve exam. A completely fictional, medicalized scenario which has become an iconic ASMR scenario. And this is, I mean, the cranial nerves, obviously the root of the brain. And the idea is that someone goes in and scratches your brain. Like there's this medical, like the latex gloves are very big. And it's like
shining a light.
So what has started to happen is the vocabulary of triggers has started to take off into a totally parallel universe, which I think is very interesting for what it tells us about cultures of care and authority, what we want from authority figures in interesting ways.
What we want from authority figures is I think is a really crucial question, because the trust that is demanded from an ASMR artist to an ASMR experiencer can be unbelievably strong. And one of the things that originally fascinated me about ASMR was the fact that especially with big ASMR artists, but even small ones, it's very rare to find trolling on comments of videos. Like the video comment section is also a space of unbelievable positivity, gratitude, and care on the most part. That may change, and of course I'm generalizing here, but you know, and the ASMR artists, talking about the ASMR artists that I know, you know, spend a lot of time responding to these messages and constructing and deepening these relationships. Like, I mean, on the one hand, it is about material culture. ASMR is about objects. On the other hand, if you think of triggers, there are also completely immaterial triggers. And I'm like incredibly interested in how kindness is a trigger, compassion is a trigger, positive affirmation is a trigger. And that is, you know, emotional labor. And the dialectic of creators, now there's a massive divide within the ASMR community about those who monetize their videos and those who don't, for instance. Monetizing your video to make a living out of this, one way of making a living out of this is automatically puts ads into the video, right? So an ASMR artist will never monetize, they'll never select the YouTube ad that breaks the video halfway through, because exactly as I read earlier, it's about trust, and you can't break that trust. So therefore, if you're going to monetize, you're going to have less valuable ads. And then you've got a camp of ASMR artists who refuse to use ads and will instead use product placement, you know, within their works. So, you know, it's also about this constant shift about what technology and tech companies, for example, allow, and how ASMR artists can work with that or subvert that.
For me, in my research, ASMR began as a backstage theatre practice. There was someone who worked at the Old Vic in the 1920s who had a practice called Of Noises Off, which was about separating sound from image and doing the sound cues off, sound effects off stage, with all these incredible processes, incredibly laborious. And now it's all done with QLab and you just hit a space bar and it goes. But originally they did them off stage like that. But he describes the strangely satisfying feeling he gets from his work. And it's ASMR. It's the exact phrasing is there. And he also boasts about how wonderful he must be to be able to sync with the actors and have all this empathy with all these different parts and bring them together using sound as a glue in that way. But suddenly what we have is backstage processes being put center stage. And that's for me what's so exciting about it, because something which is not supposed to be seen, something private, something which happens on the body, suddenly being thought of as a sole object of interest. And that specialness, that privilege of access, where you're allowed to see something that's not normally seen, or where you're allowed to have the agency to experience the process of the thing as it's happening, there's something really politically important in that. So I'm not so fond of ASMR role plays with the microphones off. I like the microphones in shot for that reason. I think that having the technology present and staging the interaction with the technology is where this becomes, it's not what we thought cyborgs would be like, but that's what it is. It's cyborg culture.
We can talk about what really allowed ASMR to exist in the first place. Well, it was the increase in infrastructure. It was the increase in high-speed internet around the world. It was the creation of the smartphone, right? And the smartphone has defined so much of our existence. If we take the iPhone as a model, which really started to shape other models, there's something utterly bizarre about this frictionless mirrored glass surface that we like sort of seductively scrape all the time, you know?
It was about talking to the object. And suddenly we kind of had this contact high from that, this incredible productivity. The oxytocine flared. There's an eruption of the real, which is what they call it in post-dramatic theatre. And for me, ASMR is a form of post-dramatic theatre, absolutely.
But there's this sort of understanding that ASMR as a field, as a creative field, which is extremely broad, has been enabled by design and technology and the design of technology. And within that, then, it has subverted what those technologies demand. So the internet demands speed. What ASMR does is subvert that in favor of slowness. With headphones in, sometimes a whisper can feel like touch. Like, it's amazing how sound can appear like touch, and it is extremely invasive, you know, if you're not used to it. So it's also interesting how technology is infiltrating our lives more and more, and it hasn't stopped yet. No, like the infiltration hasn't even begun in terms of how close we can become, how much we can mimic reality. Yeah, it's extremely interesting to hear Julie and Sigrid's observations because, of course, you know, museums are complicated things. You know? Like an institution is a complicated and loaded and charged space, and it is full of codified behaviors, from the no touch to the no run to the no eat to the no talk to the no shout. You know, this kind of, and that is an architectural question first and foremost, right? These spaces are often designed to be intimidating, and the Victorian Albert Museum is one of the greatest examples of that, right? It's designed to intimidate you. It's designed to present a hierarchy that the people behind the doors know exactly what you should know, and they're going to tell you exactly how it is. But I think we're going to also see a very complex moment evolve in the sort of community of ASMR, which is about protectionism. And that's something that you can compare to perhaps theatre or perhaps art. Is, you know, art has the gallery structure for a reason, no? And NFTs are now completely dissolving that kind of hierarchy. But where there is no real hierarchy, apart from, because, you know, like, I mean, people love ASM artists who might only have 100 subscribers because they trigger them. You know, it's not really about follower counts or fame or notoriety in the sense that it exists in other areas of the internet. But I'm concerned in a way, I suppose, about how this community, as it gets bigger, and as people start making money from it, of course, lest we forget we live in a capitalist society, and power becomes part of the culture, is what will form from that. And whether the sort of construction of hierarchies or the construction of protectionism needs to be or can be avoided.
I think it's really interesting, and I think the thing that I really look forward to in the future of ASMR is watching policymakers get it terribly wrong. I think that all of the behavioural economics people will probably be going, what? People can be influenced to do things without knowing that they're doing them. Oh wow, we can do this, and I really think that sensory cultures is something that policymakers do really, really badly. And I, you know, as an artist, as someone working in a cultural space and in the arts and humanities, it seems so apparent to me this is such an exciting interdisciplinary moment, which is why I think these talks have been so great, involving Julia Poerio and, you know, people from different disciplines. But I just know that we're going to see over the next 2 years some really awful, you know, if we whisper the government announcement, rubbish, and everyone will just be like, we know what you're doing.
Pandemic restrictions are extended by another 6 months.
You know, and everyone's going to get wise to really cynical approaches to ASMR really fast. I think people aren't stupid, and I think that the type of stupidity that policy often tries to talk to, like in the most patronizing sense possible, is exactly where ASMR is going to like show those types of initiative for what they are, which is very, very poorly thought through and very inadequate in a lot of ways. We needed the whole culture to shift, to become inclusive and to be an invitation which people actually want to have, to be a good offer, full stop, really. But I think ASMR, the fact that this set of desires has become articulated and there's more awareness around it, it gives me hope. It really does give me hope, because it's our sensitivity is starting to become explicit, and it's just really, really hard to be in public space in a lot of ways, in all the ways that, the various movements from Me Too to Black Lives Matter to all the police brutality that's going on shows. We don't want violence. We want to be treated well. And, if we could get ASMR in public spaces right, it wouldn't be about getting people to do things they didn't want to do. It would just be about them actually being, like, holistically decent places.